Well, good afternoon, everyone. No, it's a pleasure, it's a privilege to be here. And so let me start on behalf of UNDP thanking Mr. Francis, Mr. Mackenzie, Ms. Williams, and the whole team at the National Environment Protection Agency, as well as our other partners that are here today from the Planning Institute, the PIOJ, P.S. Robertson from MWEC, and everyone else that's here today with us for this important day, World Environment Day 2026, themed on climate action globally. And of course, synergizing nicely with National Environment Awareness Week and this theme of resilient recovery, green recovery. So important. As we know, this year again is another example of what the climate crisis brings. More frequent and severe events, a very hard, heavy El Nino that's shaping up, possibly as they call it, Super El Nino. And so that resilience is needed definitely going forward as we do recover from Hurricane Melissa day by day. So again, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to heed the call of Mr. Gordon, and I'm gonna focus on my chin. I did shave today, so I'm focused on my chin, and I'm gonna keep it succinct so that we can, I know it's Friday afternoon, but it is an important day to mark World Environment Day and National Environment Week, the kickoff. So I'm going to start with a presentation, and this is really focusing about recovering ecosystems and communities, particularly in Western Jamaica. Oh, right. Sorry. Yes. So firstly, as we know, there's now today more carbon in the atmosphere than there has been in 2 million years, according to global scientists. Last time there was this much carbon in the atmosphere, the Arctic was a rainforest, which is, of course, hard to imagine. But that's what the scientists tell us, that was the last time there was this much carbon up there in the atmosphere. And that carbon, of course, has been accumulating over the last couple of hundred years. And so Jamaica and other small island development states hardly a contributor to those emissions, but definitely at the front line, unfortunately, of the impacts. So we're seeing in particular in the Atlantic a rapid acceleration of ocean warming, an acceleration of those more frequent and severe systems, not least El Nino in front of us, but we saw Beryl and Melissa in recent times. Some of those ocean warming events, marine heat waves, are lasting more than 500 days, which is, of course, close to 2 years, more than a year and a half straight of a marine heat wave. So we can see that graph there in terms of how that's changed over the years, the mean annual temperatures in the ocean. So, of course, disproportionate impacts, as we know, unfortunately, for SIDS. So among the most vulnerable globally, despite upper middle income, even high income, national and per capita levels, but at the forefront of national vulnerability globally. And so that's something that we take very seriously as the UN Development Program to make sure that support and cooperation is there. Globally, we know that over 200 million people could be climate displaced in the coming decades and pushed back into poverty because of this process. And so this climate inequality hybrid, the connection between climate impacts and growing inequality and the possible pushback into poverty, is really a need to rethink development, rethink what recovery looks like, but also, of course, prevention and towards more restorative pathways, including for restorative ecosystems and communities. And so therefore, it's a call, of course, this event today on World Environment Day to really prioritize green recovery, ecosystem restoration. And we stand steadfast as UNDP, together with our partners in MWEC and in NEPA and other ministries, communities across the country, in actually trying to achieve that goal of restoration of ecosystems and communities as we recover from Melissa. For 25 years, firstly, a big congratulations to NEPA, of course, on the 25-year anniversary. Yes. And for 25 years, it's also for us an anniversary of UNDP partnership and support to NEPA. And that's something that we're very proud of. A lot of successful initiatives over the years, whether it's around the national parks, around the marine protected areas, establishing pilots and then scaling that up over those 25 years. And that's something that we continue to put as a success story for UNDP cooperation here in Jamaica over the past 25 years. Now, key priorities going forward this year and forward on coral mangrove restoration, rehabilitating eroded coastlines, reforestation of decimated landscapes, watershed recovery, integrating green solutions into building design as buildings come back, whether it's on roofing or structures themselves, and other infrastructure. There's a big space to integrate green solutions into that infrastructure build back that's taking shape. So the national economies and local livelihoods have a heavy dependence on these natural systems. And so this vulnerability to the natural systems, of course, is affecting multi-dimensional poverty. So yes, income levels, but there's those other dimensions of inequality and poverty that are really shaped by this degrading ecosystem, these challenges of vulnerability. I won't linger too much, as we all know, that it was the strongest ever Hurricane Melissa in modern history of Jamaica. The upper ranges of Category 5, almost pushing for really defining what Category 6 looks like, because it was really at the upper ranges of Category 5. Loss and damages from the United Nations Loss and Damage Assessment report with government. $12 billion that Jamaica has suffered from this one event. And that's close, of course, to 60% of 2024 annual GDP. And so this is one of the most catastrophic impacts of any country. It was the record, the biggest impact, 2025. But even if you look back at modern history globally, it's really historic in that sense as well. Of course, our colleagues at UE, the climate group, immediately after landfall did a very good analysis showing that Hurricane Melissa, the severity of its impact was 6 times more likely because of climate change specifically, right? And so that was a very important contribution by the UE climate group to actually, that particular element of the connection to the climate crisis. New world record set, tying Hurricane Dorian a number of years ago, and that world record setting, on landfall in New Hope. So this is really unprecedented, but also unfortunately a new bar. So we can unfortunately expect more severe and frequent disasters into the future as we know the trends. Now, when you talk about the impacts, as we've seen from the UN assessment and other assessments, the ecosystem component of overall loss and damage was a significant one. When we look at the loss side of the tabulation, about 30% of all the losses, apart from the damages on the damage side, but on the losses from Hurricane Melissa, 30% of all that is related to environment. According to NEPA and Ministry of Forestry analysis, more than 40% of forests have been impacted, over 2,000 hectares of mangroves, and more than 90% of mangroves in those impact hotspots in Western Jamaica. And of course, as we know, the government have identified 8 sites for priority restoration works, St. Elizabeth, Westmoreland, Montego Bay, Falmouth, and other areas. And these actions are aligned under the national strategies. And we, of course, commend the government for its work on the emerging National Ecosystem Restoration Plan, which is an important framework not just for this event, of course, but going forward in general to restore Jamaica's ecosystems from various impacts. So again, priorities for building back better in the coast, but also inland. Particularly water retention is a major priority, not least this year with the impacts of Hurricane El Nino, with the risk of drought. And we saw what that was like, the back-to-back 2023 record drought and water issues after that barrel, after that Melissa. So you really kind of have to prioritize those most vulnerable communities that are trying to, again, recover when there's another crisis potentially on the horizon. Now, in terms of priorities for green recovery, from our perspective, the use of strategic environmental assessments. So using environmental assessment methodology at the upstream when we're thinking about national recovery framework, the National Recovery Plan, those subnational recovery plans as well, looking at them at the upstream, at the early stage in terms of integrating, reducing risks, for future risks, in terms of that infrastructure reconstruction, but also the much of the other work that's going to be focused under those plans. I think that's a very strong opportunity since we're still at that stage of crafting these plans. And as we know, there's billions of dollars of large-scale investments foreseen from domestic budget, from international partners. So that's one priority, I think, is on the assessment and planning side. I think it's good to also think about it in terms of, we have a big focus, of course, as UNDP, but also, of course, in government as a country on the social security system. How do you enhance the ability of communities to have that human security level through a social security system? I think it's time to start thinking about ecosystems as a security system as well, thinking of it as an ecological security system. Because if we see these services from the ecosystem that have been impacted by Melissa, we can see also how that's impacting social security and human security on the left side. Livelihoods, clearly, when you talk about whether it's poultry farmers or farmers in general, fisher folk, other livelihoods that have been impacted. But I think this kind of analysis, this kind of framework would be important in terms of building back better or recovering in terms of a policy framework, making policies and approaches to human security also really factor it in within development, not as an environment issue, but really bringing it to the concept of development itself. And so as UNDP, we launched last year what we call the Multidimensional Poverty Index Global Report. And this is looking at multiple deprivations on the social side. But for the first time, we've focused this global report on the nexus to climate change and ecosystems, and how that is a source of multidimensional poverty. And so this was the first time, as I said, in this global report that we're looking at those layers of how the climate and ecosystem vulnerability adds a layer to various pre-existing social vulnerabilities and multidimensional aspects. If you see here on the orange graphs, the orange bars, that's when you put that climate and ecosystem overlay. That's the added vulnerability to those various determinants of social vulnerability, right? Child mortality goes from 21 to 116 as an indicator when you add on that climate and ecological hazard. And the list is down there. Water goes from 15.153 to 355, which is a bit more intuitive when it comes to water. But when you think of some of the others, housing, again, as we saw, unfortunately, last year, heavy impacts from the climate crisis. And so here in Jamaica, we supported a human impact assessment through the strong cooperation with the PIOJ and other partners. And that's really looking at specifically at the human impact at the micro level, let's say. And that's something that's about to be published. It's being finalized, and it's about to be published, but that'll look a little bit more nuanced at the multidimensional poverty element of what happened from Hurricane Melissa. And then to overlay that with subnational climate maps and analyses, which are also emerging, so that we can make this strong vulnerability nexus in advance and to plan ahead effectively. As we know, many parishes that were affected by Hurricane Melissa were already suffering from 20-25% multidimensional poverty rates. So income poverty rates obviously, have improved significantly over the years. But multidimensional poverty is still significant challenges. And so with the impacts of Hurricane Melissa, that increased, of course. 30 to 40% multidimensional poverty in some of those communities that have been impacted. And so that's serious, that's significant. And this nexus then again between ecosystems and social vulnerability is quite critical to understand during the recovery as well. We recently completed UNDP together with UN Environment, UNEP, and with the UN Disaster Agency, UNDRR, a joint review of the environment sector within disaster needs assessments to integrate that effectively into disaster needs assessments. There's the Multidimensional Poverty Index report, which I recommend in terms of that nexus, specifically to climate and ecosystems. And we also launched last year a broader report on development at risk, which looks at the multiple crises before us, including the economic crisis around energy, et cetera. So now I'll come, I think it was Mr. Francis that said earlier, or Mr. Gordon that said earlier that, it's not just the theory, but what are we doing about it? So I also want to spend a little bit of time just talking about some of the initiatives that we have ongoing, or some of the initiatives that you have ongoing that we're supporting here in Jamaica. So firstly, UNDP implements about $4 billion US dollars of grants for the green transition, 140 countries around the world. So we're the largest in the UN team in terms of implementing grants for environment, for the green transition. And in Latin America, Caribbean, these are the statistics here. Currently, close to $700 million US dollars of projects across the region, and another 300 million that are under development. So this is really a priority for UNDP. In a way that really connects with that social inequality agenda, in particular, many of the projects that we do undertake. One example is the Jamaica Resilient Recovery Initiative, or JARI, that we launched weeks after landfall with the strong support of the European Union, the CARICOM Caribbean Development Fund, the CDF, AusAid, and other partners. And that one of the key things at the upstream level, again, is those assessments, as I mentioned, the human impact assessment, collaboration for other assessments, but importantly, collaboration on a new national spatial plan, which is quite critical when you talk about land use on a preventive side to reduce the risks of impacts, whether it's to human life, to buildings, to infrastructure investments, to protecting ecosystems, of course, in terms of no-build zones. So that cooperation with the government on the national spatial planning process is quite critical. And then local plans for specific areas, like the work we're doing with NEPA, UDC, and others around Black River, around the Black River area. Now, local action grants for the communities also under this initiative. So we've scaled up solar solutions for some of the communities that had kind of lingering challenges with electricity access, or to, in fact, build a resilience so that when a new system comes, they have that locally to be able to continue energy access through those solar systems should, the grid get cut again in future events. So building that resilience, community resilience, economic resilience, social resilience through solar systems. Debris management, as was mentioned earlier, close to 5 million metric tons, of course, were created at Hurricane Melissa island-wide. And so that's a major challenge that's ongoing. And supporting those SMEs, those small and medium-sized enterprises, informal and formal, to really restart those livelihoods. A very dedicated focus, of course, through our partnership with NEPA on mountains and forest ecosystems. And so a large-scale initiative that's taking off in earnest. Nationally, of course, as we know, a significant impact on the West, on the cockpit country. It's a critical ecosystem globally. It hosts 60% of the island's vascular plants, a primary sanctuary for amphibians, birds, island-wide, as a sanctuary island-wide. And of course, it was in the direct path of Hurricane Melissa, as seen in the map. Major loss and damage, major damages, of course, the communities, but also losses to those ecosystem services, which are national ecosystem services. So it provides 40% of the groundwater across Jamaica. 40 rivers and streams originate from the watersheds around the cockpit country. So in terms of local action, the new initiative that's going to be launched is focusing on a number of key actions. And I want to again express thanks for the cooperation with NEPA and other partners on this initiative, which is going to bring some tangible green recovery potentials locally. One is supporting zoning in the protected area and monitoring of the species recovery in the cockpit country. Prioritizing native species, so in terms of reforestation, as we know, choosing some of the native species rather than the pine and other species. Landscape planning, protecting some of those intact forests. So in the scheme, the grand sweep of all the impacts, actually there were some bright spots where somehow forests were able to withstand better than others. So resilience anchors, building on those intact forests for future conservation efforts. Green infrastructure. So as we know, they provide a significant amount of water security to Jamaica and other resources. So thinking of those watersheds and those ecosystems in the cockpit area as that critical green infrastructure for the national economy, but also for those critical social security dimensions I mentioned earlier. Engaging local communities, of course, as agents of change. There'll be a very important local grant facility to bolster community resilience, supporting SMEs, and expanding good practices for sustainable resource use, including potential really for getting more traction and impact on recovery of ecosystems. A second example I just want to highlight, which is worth highlighting in the discussion, is of course the impact on the tourism sector, which was significant from Hurricane Melissa. And so another large-scale initiative together with Minister Bartlett and team and private sector from across the country in terms of the tourism sector. And this is really towards integrating green solutions into the tourism sector, whether it's in terms of buildings, designs, in terms of that build back, not just big, but also medium-sized and small facilities and community tourism, et cetera. The whole ecosystem, really, all the SMEs that are linked to the tourism sector. So public-private partnerships to scale up sustainable tourism goals, support to the small and medium tourism enterprises for new investment projects that can actually achieve this national goal of ecosystem restoration and greening. Supply chains opportunity really to bring back, build back in a way that expands the ecotourism sector specifically, along with branding, along with that global connection. This is an initiative that UNDP leads in the UN system, but then we also have UN World Tourism Organization and a number of other UN agencies connected to that program. Solar for Recovery, I won't spend too much time on, but that's a program we're going to expand out to their strong cooperation with MWEC and other partners. That's really, again, to build that community resilience, to have that energy solution locally so that when a disaster does strike, there's that extra support, that extra asset for communities to lean on. And that also reduces, as we know, the growing energy costs, so that creating some fiscal space also for families and communities to allocate to health, education, and other priorities. I would, not do justice to our cooperation with all of you without mentioning our small grants program, our community grants. So we have about $3 million across Jamaica, Belize, and Bahamas to provide direct grants to CSOs and NGOs across the country. Here in Jamaica, we just launched, I think last week, if I recall, our next phase of these grants to CSOs and NGOs. And so that's critical support to, for example, some of those local NGOs that are in charge of the fish sanctuaries or the coral restoration sites, or various other activities. Sometimes it's about small business artisans, nature-based products, but in the cultural space or the artisan space. So that's really important, again, from both recovery of communities as well as the ecosystems. Now, as we're speaking of Hurricane Melissa and major disaster impacts, of course, we have the new Global Fund for Response to Loss and Damage, which is just getting underway, providing the first round of grants. And so, as a comparative example, in Belize, we've submitted just last week a large submission together with the ministry to specifically focus on the ecosystem element of loss and damage, actually. So almost $500 million of loss and damage in recent decades in Belize. And so this project is going to be able to formally recognize in the national system, legislatively and otherwise, the non-economic losses, such as ecosystem services. We provided support earlier to a national loss and damage framework in Belize, which is quite an important base for doing these initiatives. But this is also prioritizing those community, social, and ecological recovery needs. So it's not just about big infrastructure. but also early warning information systems, etc. In the Bahamas, another just comparative example that's useful is, in the years after Dorian, we decided to support climate risk finance scale-up in the Bahamas. And so this is specifically around climate-based insurance products. So in addition to the support from a CRIF or cat bonds, etc., there's more to be done to actually bring that social protection, adaptive social protection, as it's called, to those communities. And so this initiative is going to be focusing on some of the farmer communities and some of the family islands in Bahamas to bring those insurance products to small-scale farmers that may not be eligible otherwise for, larger-scale insurance often. Informal sector, not everybody's always eligible or easy to access climate insurance. So this is, again, looking at that connection of climate and inequality. And this builds on this important photo down here on the right, which was just launched late last year, which is a new Category 5 hurricane shelter community center that we launched in Abaco through the valuable support of India. And that's able to withstand above Category 5, actually. It went to the higher ranges of Category 5 in case another Dorian comes their way. And so this is also something we had very good discussions with Meg ID also about, what would infrastructure that can withstand Category 5 in terms of shelters look like, whether it's centralized examples like that in community centers or decentralized approaches at the community or household level. So that's an important piece of the puzzle in terms of recovering and building those things in a climate resilient, ecological resilient way, those facilities in terms of water use and energy use, etc. And that concludes a quick snapshot. I hope I did justice to Mr. Gordon's call to action in terms of shaving off the sermon, but I hope that was useful and provides a bit of insight to bolster the amazing insights from Mr. Francis and Mr. Gordon earlier. Thank you.